It was a grey morning in the South Atlantic, and the sea was choppy. Waves crashed against the hull of the small coastal aircraft, flying low, so low that the crew could feel the salty humidity seeping into the fuselage. The pilot, a young Brazilian coastal aviation officer named Lieutenant Alberto Martins Torres, was only 26, but his eyes held the determination of someone forged by war. It was July of 1943, and the world was immersed in the most devastating conflict humanity had ever witnessed. World War II spared no continent, no ocean, and certainly no one who dared sail in the waters off the Brazilian coast. That morning's mission was simple in theory, but deadly in practice. Patrol Brazilian territorial waters in search of German submarines that, like ravenous wolves, stalked merchant ships carrying vital resources to the Allies. Brazil had officially entered the war on the Allied side in August 1942, after a series of brutal German submarine attacks that sank Brazilian ships and killed hundreds of innocent civilians. National outrage had been immense. The Brazilian people, peaceful by nature, found themselves forced into a conflict that seemed distant but had literally reached their doorsteps, their beaches and their waters. Torres adjusted the navigation instruments while his co-pilot, Sergeant Paulo Mendes, checked the maps. They were flying a Hudson, a US-made maritime patrol aircraft that Brazil had received as part of military cooperation agreements. It wasn't the most modern aircraft nor the fastest, but it was reliable. And at that moment, reliability was all that mattered. In the bomb bay, 2 depth charges waited, silent and deadly, ready to be dropped at the slightest sign of an enemy submarine. Before we continue, if you're enjoying this incredible story, please subscribe to the channel and leave a comment letting us know what time you're watching. Your participation is crucial for us to continue bringing you these extraordinary stories. The fog was beginning to dissipate when the navigator, Corporal Roberto Silva, suddenly pointed to the ocean's surface. There, about 3,000 meters away, a long dark shape broke the surface of the water. It was unmistakable. A submarine. Torres's heart raced instantly. All the months of training, all the simulations, all the briefings converged on that single moment. There was the enemy, real, tangible, deadly. It was a German U-boat, probably a 7 or 9 series, the sea lions that had terrorized the Atlantic since the beginning of the war. These submarines were sophisticated war machines, equipped with devastating torpedoes, and crewed by experienced sailors who knew every secret of the ocean's depths. Torres didn't hesitate. He pushed the stick forward, initiating a controlled descent toward the target. The Hudson's engine roared as the aircraft gained speed. The wind whistled against the wings. Inside the cockpit, every man knew exactly what he had to do. There was no room for error. A surfaced submarine was vulnerable, but only for a moment. German commanders were trained to dive quickly at the first sign of aerial danger. Torres had perhaps 90 seconds, perhaps less, before the submarine disappeared into the depths, where it would be nearly impossible to attack accurately. The submarine had detected the aircraft. This was evident from the sudden commotion on deck. Tiny figures, German crewmen, were rushing toward the conning tower. The hatch was already closing. Torres could picture the U-boat commander shouting orders, demanding maximum diving speed. Every second counted. The distance was rapidly decreasing. 2,500 meters, 2,000 meters, 1,800. Torres adjusted the angle of approach, mentally calculating the wind speed, the aircraft's drift, the submarine's speed, and the likely depth it would reach at the moment of bomb impact. But there was a problem. One Torres recognized with a flash of tactical awareness possessed only by the most experienced pilots. The submarine was diving at a specific angle, following an evasive pattern that German commanders had perfected through years of combat. If Torres dropped the bombs on their current trajectory, following the standard attack manual, the submarine would likely escape. The explosion would occur a few meters behind or to the side of the target, causing minor damage, perhaps no significant damage. The U-boat could then disappear, repair any minor damage, and continue its mission of destruction, sinking more ships, killing more merchant sailors, prolonging the war. 1,500 meters. The decision had to be made now. Torres could follow standard procedure, drop the bombs as he had been trained and probably fail. Or he could do something different, something risky, something he had never practiced in simulations. He could anticipate the submarine's movement, calculate where it would be not at the moment of launch, but at the moment of impact 3 or 4 seconds later. It was an impossible calculation to make accurately. It involved dozens of variables: the submarine's exact speed, the depth it would reach, the ocean currents, the bomb's fall time, the crosswind. It was a gamble. A gamble where the prize was the destruction of an enemy war machine, and the price of failure was wasting precious ammunition and allowing the enemy to escape. 1,200 meters. Co-pilot Mendez looked at Torres, waiting for the order to prepare the bombs. Torres took a deep breath. He thought of his wife, Maria, whom he had left behind in Recife. He thought of his 2-year-old son, who barely knew him because he spent weeks at sea protecting the coast. He thought of the Brazilian sailors who had died when the Bapendi was torpedoed, 270 men who sank into the dark waters without a chance to defend themselves. He thought of his responsibility. He thought of his mission. And then, in a moment of absolute clarity, Torres made his decision. He wouldn't follow standard procedure. He would modify the approach angle at the last second, adjusting the launch point to compensate for the submarine's evasive movement. It was a maneuver that required perfect timing, absolute coordination, and a dose of intuition that couldn't be taught in any flight school. It would either work perfectly or it would fail completely. There was no middle ground 1,000 meters. The submarine's conning tower had disappeared beneath the surface. Only the stern was still visible, creating a white wake as the U-boat rapidly dove. Torres banked the aircraft slightly to the left, a barely perceptible but crucial movement. He was compensating not only for the submarine's current movement, but for the movement it would make in the next 3 seconds. It was like shooting at a moving target, but the target was underwater, invisible, and moving in 3 dimensions, half a mile. Torres's hands were firm on the control stick. His heart was pounding, but his mind was calm, focused, constantly calculating. The world around him seemed to have slowed down. He could hear the roar of the engine, the whistle of the wind, Mendez's heavy breathing beside him. He could feel every vibration of the aircraft, every movement of the air beneath the wings, 600 meters. The last visible part of the submarine was about to disappear. This was the critical moment. If Torres waited another second, the submarine would be too deep. If he launched too soon, the bomb would explode far from the target. It had to be now. It had to be perfect. Torres shouted the order. Mendez actuated the release mechanism. The first depth charge released from the bomb bay with a metallic click. A second later, the second followed. The bombs tumbled through the air, spinning slightly, accelerating toward the ocean surface. Torres pulled back on the control stick, initiating a steep climb away from the blast zone. The Hudson groaned with the effort but responded, gaining altitude rapidly. The depth charges hit the water with a force that created 2 columns of white foam. They penetrated the surface and began to sink rapidly, descending through the blue and green layers of the ocean. Inside each bomb, a hydrostatic mechanism measured the water pressure, waiting to reach the programmed depth. 15 meters, 20 meters, 25. The mechanisms were simple but reliable, developed through years of experience in anti-submarine warfare. Torres made a sharp turn, bringing the aircraft back over the attack area. Everyone in the cockpit watched the ocean's surface with painful intensity. Had the calculations worked? Had the last-second move been correct? Or had the submarine escaped, laughing at its pursuers in the safety of the depths? And then it happened. The water exploded. It wasn't a small or contained explosion. It was a massive eruption of water, foam and energy that sent a column of ocean tens of meters into the air. The first charge had detonated exactly where Torres had predicted. A second later, the second bomb exploded, creating another gigantic column of water. The 2 explosions fused into a single display of destructive power that made the very surface of the ocean seem to boil. But the most important, the most crucial, appeared seconds later. Oil slicks began to rise to the surface. These weren't small slicks. It was a massive spill spreading rapidly, creating an ominous rainbow of hydrocarbons in the water. Then came the wreckage. Twisted chunks of metal, plating, fragments of internal equipment, and then horribly and unmistakably bodies began to surface. German crewmen, some still wearing their blue Kriegsmarine uniforms, floated motionless on the surface. The submarine had been destroyed. Torres's last-second move had worked perfectly. The bombs had exploded right next to the U-boat's hull at its most vulnerable moment, descending through the water column. The combined pressure of the two explosions had cracked the pressurized hull like an eggshell. Ocean water had instantly flooded every compartment. The crew had stood no chance. Death had been swift, if not instantaneous. Torres felt a complex mix of emotions as he flew over the scene of destruction. There was triumph, certainly. He had accomplished his mission. He had eliminated a deadly threat to Brazilian shipping lanes. That submarine would no longer sink merchant ships, no longer kill innocent civilians. But there was also a profound sadness. Those men in the water, those German crewmen, were human beings. They had families, they had dreams, they had stories. The war had turned them into enemies, but they were still human. Torres felt no pleasure in their deaths, only the grim satisfaction of having protected his own people. Mendez was meticulously recording everything. The exact time of the attack, precise coordinates, number of bombs used, visual observations of the wreckage. This would be a crucial report. Confirmation of a submarine destroyed was a significant event. Each U-boat eliminated was a step toward final victory, a reduction in the German ability to strangle Allied supply lines. The aircraft continued patrolling the area for another 30 minutes, documenting the wreckage, ensuring there were no survivors who could be rescued. There were none. The attack had been devastatingly effective. Finally, with fuel dwindling, Torres turned the Hudson back toward base. The return flight was silent. Each man was lost in his own thoughts, processing what had just happened. When they landed at the airbase, a crowd was already waiting. News traveled fast through the military installations. A sunken submarine was cause for celebration. Torres and his crew were welcomed as heroes. The base commander personally congratulated them, shaking hands with each man. There would be medals, there would be promotions, there would be official recognition. But Torres knew the true meaning of what had happened wasn't in the medals or the congratulations. It was in the ships that could now sail with a little more safety. It was in the merchant marines who might not die, because that particular submarine had been eliminated. Over the following days, Brazilian and American naval intelligence worked to identify which submarine had been sunk. Through analysis of the recovered wreckage, the markings on the metal and the equipment found, they eventually reached a conclusion. It was U-boat 513, a Type 9C submarine that had left its base in occupied France 3 months earlier. It had 48 crew members on board. None survived. The commander was Captain Lieutenant Friedrich Guggenberger, a decorated veteran with several sinkings to his name. He was one of the Kriegsmarine's most successful commanders, responsible for sinking tens of thousands of tons of Allied shipping. His death, though tragic on a human level, was unquestionably a significant victory for the Allies. Torres's attack became a case study in naval aviation schools. The last-second movement, the anticipation of the submarine's evasive pattern, the perfect timing of the bomb drop, everything was analyzed and incorporated into training manuals. Future pilots would learn from that moment of tactical brilliance. They would learn that sometimes following the manual isn't enough. Sometimes victory requires improvisation, intuition, and the courage to do something different at the critical moment. But the story didn't end there. In the following weeks, Torres continued his patrols. He flew dozens of additional missions over the South Atlantic. Some were uneventful, with nothing but empty ocean sightings. Others were tense, with false alarms and targets that turned out to be whales or schools of fish. And there was one mission, 6 weeks after the first sinking, where Torres spotted another submarine. This time the story was different. The U-boat was more alert, dived faster, and Torres's bombs missed their target by meters. The submarine escaped. It was a humbling reminder that success was not guaranteed, that every encounter was unique, that luck played a role alongside skill. The war continued. Month after month, year after year. Torres flew until 1945, when the war in Europe finally ended. He survived. Many of his colleagues were not so lucky. Aircraft were lost to mechanical failures, storms and attacks by submarines that managed to return fire with their anti-aircraft guns. Maritime aviation was dangerous. Every mission carried the risk of not returning, When peace finally came, Torres returned home. He reunited with Maria, got to know his now 4-year-old son properly, and tried to rebuild a normal life. But the memories lingered, especially the memory of that July day, that last-second move, that critical decision that had changed the outcome of the encounter. He thought about the German crewmen often. He wondered about their lives, their families, what had led them to serve on submarines. He didn't feel guilt exactly. He had done his duty, protected his country, saved Brazilian lives. But he felt a deep melancholy for the necessity of it all, for the tragedy of war that turned decent men into mortal enemies. Years later, long after the war, Torres had an extraordinary experience. He was attending an international conference on naval history in Washington, D.C., and there he met Otto Kretschmer, a former German U-boat commander who had been captured by the British in 1941. Kretschmer was a legend in the Kriegsmarine, the most successful submarine commander of the war. The two men, former enemies, talked for hours. They shared stories, perspectives, memories. Kretschmer spoke of the terror of being attacked by aircraft, the terrifying vulnerability of being on the surface with planes approaching. Torres spoke of the tension of hunting an enemy who could disappear in seconds, the crushing responsibility of making split-second decisions. It was a conversation that changed Torres. He realized, perhaps for the first time, that there were no simple heroes and villains in this story. There were men doing the best they could under impossible circumstances, serving their countries, protecting their comrades, trying to survive. The war had placed them on opposing sides, but humanity united them. Torres lived until 1997. He had a long and generally happy life. He had 3 children, 7 grandchildren, and a respectable career in civil aviation after the war. But always, until his last days, he carried that moment with him. The moment when he saw the submarine, made his calculations, made his decision, executed his last-second move. It was the defining moment of his life, the action for which he would be remembered, the story that would be told and retold. On Torres's headstone, set in a quiet cemetery in Recife, there is a simple inscription: his name, his dates of birth and death, his final rank of colonel, and one line: coastal pilot who served with honor. It doesn't mention the sunken submarine, the medal he received, or the last-second move that became legendary. Because Torres, in the end, didn't want to be remembered simply as a warrior. He wanted to be remembered as a man who did his duty when called, but who valued peace above all else. The story of Torres's last-second move teaches us several lessons. It teaches us about courage, about the human capacity to make critical decisions under extreme pressure. It teaches us about skill, about the importance of training, but also of the intuition that goes beyond training. It teaches us about war, about its horror and its occasional necessity, about the terrible toll it takes on everyone involved. And it teaches us about humanity, about the importance of remembering that even our enemies are human, deserving of respect even in defeat. The South Atlantic today is peaceful. Cargo ships and oil tankers traverse its waters without fear of torpedoes. Tourists fly over the ocean in comfortable jets, oblivious to the deadly tragedies that occurred in those same waters decades ago. U-boat 513 rests on the ocean floor, a tomb for 48 German sailors who never returned home. And somewhere above, in the collective memory of those who know the story, lives the spirit of Lieutenant Torres, making his last-second move, saving lives through a moment of tactical brilliance. This is a story about war, but also about peace, about conflict, but also about reconciliation, about death, but also about the life that was preserved. It's a reminder that history is complex, that heroes are human, that victories have costs, and that we must always seek to understand the past in all its complexity, not in simple black and white, but in all the shades of gray that exist between the extremes. May we learn from these stories. May we honor the sacrifice of all who served on all sides, as we work to ensure such sacrifices are never necessary again. May we remember that every soldier, every sailor, every airman has a story, a family, a humanity that transcends the uniforms they wear and the flags they serve. And may we, above all, have the wisdom to value peace, to work for understanding between nations, to build a world where last-second moves are only necessary in sporting competitions and not in mortal combat. Because in the end, we all share this planet, we all breathe the same air, we all gaze at the same stars. The borders that divide us are lines on maps, but the humanity that unites us is eternal. But let's return to that July day in 1943, because there's more to be said about what happened after the submarine sank. When Torres and his crew returned to base, they found not only celebration, but also a meticulous debriefing process that would last days. Intelligence officers wanted to know every detail. Every second of the encounter was reconstructed, analyzed, and studied. How exactly had the submarine been spotted? What was its exact position? What kind of evasive maneuver had it executed? How had Torres calculated the launch point? What was the interval between the two bombs? What kind of wreckage was observed? These questions were not mere bureaucratic curiosity. Every bit of information was crucial to the broader anti-submarine war. The Germans constantly refined their evasion tactics, and the Allies constantly needed to adapt their attack techniques. Torres's success represented valuable data that could save lives in future encounters. His reports were copied and sent to naval commands in Washington, London, and other Allied capitals. Pilots elsewhere in the world would read about this last-second move and attempt to replicate it in their own missions. Torres discovered, in the weeks after the attack, that fame was a double-edged sword. On the one hand, there was legitimate pride. He had done something extraordinary. He had protected his country. He had fulfilled his mission with exceptional distinction. But on the other hand, there was pressure, expectations. Every time he took off on a new patrol, there was the implicit feeling that he must repeat his success, that he must find and sink another submarine. It was an impossible and unfair expectation, but it was real. In August 1943, just a month after the first sinking, Torres flew a mission that nearly ended in disaster. They spotted what appeared to be a submarine on the surface, but as they approached, they discovered it was a bank of submerged rocks, creating an unusual wave pattern. Torres had almost ordered the bombs dropped. Had he done so, he would have wasted precious ammunition on rocks. It was a humbling reminder that not everything that appears to be a submarine actually is. Correct identification was as important as attack skill. In October of that same year, Torres had another significant encounter. This time he spotted not one, but two submarines cruising together on the surface, something extremely rare. U-boats typically operated alone to maximize their coverage area and minimize the chance of detection. Seeing two together suggested something important, perhaps a resupply at sea, a supply transfer, or even a large-scale coordinated operation. Torres faced an immediate dilemma. He had only two bombs but two targets. Attacking one submarine meant alerting the other, which would then dive immediately and escape. But not attacking meant allowing both to continue their deadly operations. Torres made the decision to attack the nearest submarine, hoping that the explosion would damage both if they were close enough. The attack was executed with precision, but this time the results were mixed. The explosion occurred near the first submarine, creating a massive column of water. Oil stains appeared, suggesting damage, but the submarine didn't sink immediately. It dove, clearly damaged but still functional. The second submarine was gone within seconds. Torres circled the area for an hour, hoping the damaged submarine would be forced to surface, but it never did. German records examined after the war revealed that submarine, U-541, had been severely damaged and forced to return to base, where it spent months undergoing repairs. It didn't sink, but it was effectively removed from the war for a crucial period. Sometimes victories aren't absolute, but they are still victories. Torres's life during the war was a tense routine, punctuated by moments of terror. Waking before dawn, briefings with intelligence officers about known or suspected submarine movements, meticulous inspection of the aircraft, every instrument, every system, every bomb. Take off at first light. Hours of flying over the ocean, eyes constantly scanning the surface, searching for any irregularity, any dark shadow, any unusual pattern in the waves. The monotony was occasionally broken by radar alarms or visual sightings, most of which turned out to be false. And then, rarely, the moment of actual contact with the enemy, when all the training, all the experience, all the courage were tested, but there were also moments of unexpected beauty. Torres flew over the Atlantic in all conditions and saw things few humans witness. Sunrises over the ocean that painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, impossible to describe. Storms that formed on the horizon like black walls of cloud, pulsing with internal lightning. Humpback whales migrating in pods, their massive tails breaking the surface in movements that seemed choreographed. Dolphins surfing the waves created by the aircraft, seemingly reveling in the company. Nights when he flew beneath a sky so full of stars, it seemed possible to reach out and touch them. These moments reminded Torres that there was more to the world than war, that there was beauty and wonder that transcended human conflicts. Torres also developed a deep respect for the ocean during these years. The Atlantic wasn't just a battlefield, it was a force unto itself. Indifferent to the human dramas unfolding on its surface and depths, the ocean could be as calm as glass one morning, and hours later transform into a hell of 10-meter waves that threatened to rip off aircraft wings. It could perfectly conceal submarines or reveal them with bioluminescent patterns at night. It was a hostile, indifferent environment that forgave no mistakes. Many aircraft were lost not to enemy fire, but to the fury of the ocean itself. In 1944, the tide of war began to turn decisively against Germany. The U-boat threat, while still significant, had diminished considerably. The Allies had developed new detection technologies, new convoy procedures, and new anti-submarine tactics. The Germans were losing submarines faster than they could build them. The Battle of the Atlantic, that desperate struggle for control of the sea lanes, was being won by the Allies. Torres continued to fly patrols, but submarine sightings became increasingly rare. The missions were important for maintaining surveillance, but the deadly intensity of previous years had diminished. It was during this period that Torres began to think seriously about the post-war period. What would he do when peace finally arrived? Military aviation was all he had known since enlisting at 20. He had grown up in the war, matured through it, defined himself by it. Who would he be in a time of peace? The question haunted him during the long flights over the ocean. He considered returning to school, perhaps studying engineering. He considered joining civil aviation, flying commercial routes instead of combat patrols. He considered simply returning home, embracing his family, and never flying again. In May of 1945, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Torres was at his base when the news arrived. There were celebrations, tears of joy, hugs between comrades who had survived against all odds. But there was also a sense of emptiness, of disorientation. The war had defined their lives for years. Now that it was over, what came next? How would they return to normal life? Was it possible to return after all they had seen and done? Torres was demobilized in August 1945. He received his discharge with honors, several medals including the Order of Aeronautical Merit, and formal gratitude from the nation. But what he treasured more than any medal was the letter he received from the father of a merchant seaman whose ship had sailed the route Torres patrolled. The father wrote to thank Torres for protecting his son, for making it possible for him to return home. That letter, handwritten on plain paper, meant more to Torres than any official ceremony. It reminded him of why he had fought, of the true purpose behind every patrol, every risk, every difficult decision. The transition to civilian life was difficult. Torres found work as an instructor pilot, teaching the next generation of aviators. It was satisfying work, but it lacked the intensity, the urgent purpose of war. He struggled with occasional nightmares, flashes of memory that woke him in the middle of the night. He saw the submarine diving, saw the explosion, saw the bodies floating. It wasn't every night, and over time it became less frequent, but it never completely disappeared. It was the price many veterans paid, an invisible toll taken by years of combat stress. But Torres also discovered joys in peace. He was present when his second son was born in 1947, something impossible during the war when he was constantly deployed. He taught his eldest son to swim, ride a bike, and build kites. He planted a garden behind his house, discovering the deep satisfaction in making things grow rather than destroying them. He reconnected with old school friends, rebuilt relationships that the war had broken. He learned slowly and with effort to be a civilian again. In 1950, Torres did something unexpected. He wrote a letter to the International Red Cross, trying to discover the names of the crew of the U-513. He wanted to know who the men he had killed were. Not out of guilt, but out of respect, out of a desire to honor their memories as human beings and not just as abstract enemies. It took almost 2 years, but eventually he received a list. 48 names. 48 men between the ages of 18 and 42. Men from towns and cities across Germany. Men who had left behind parents, wives, children, brothers. Torres kept that list for the rest of his life. He didn't show it to many people, but occasionally he would take it out and read the names aloud, a kind of private ritual of remembrance. He didn't know what each name meant, didn't know their individual stories, but the act of speaking their names felt important, a way of acknowledging that they had existed, that their lives had had meaning, that their deaths, though necessary in the context of war, were still tragedies. Years later, in the 1960s, Torres had the opportunity to visit Germany as part of a cultural exchange program for veterans. He went to Kiel, where many U-boats had been based, and visited a memorial to submariners lost in the war. Thousands of names were engraved in stone. Torres searched for and found the names of the crew of U-513. He stood there for a long time, silent, remembering. An elderly German woman noticed him and asked if he had lost anyone in the war. Torres replied, with an honesty that surprised him, that yes, he had lost something, perhaps a part of his own innocence, perhaps a belief in the possibility of a world without violence. They talked for hours, the Brazilian veteran and the German widow, whose husband had died on a U-boat in 1943. It wasn't the U-boat in 1943, but it easily could have been. They shared their losses, their memories, their hopes that their children and grandchildren would never have to go through what they had. It was a conversation that brought healing to both of them, a recognition that the suffering of war transcended nationalities, that everyone who lived through those years on all sides had paid a price. Torres returned to Brazil with a transformed perspective. He began speaking publicly about his experiences, not to glorify war but to warn of its costs. He visited schools, telling his stories to young people who had no direct memory of World War II. He emphasized not only the dramatic moment of the submarine's sinking, but also the moral complexities, the weight of decisions, and the shared humanity even amidst conflict. He wanted young people to understand that war was not an adventure or glory, but a tragedy and a grim necessity. In 1973, Torres attended a reunion of veterans of Brazilian coastal aviation. Men he hadn't seen in decades were there, now with grey or missing hair, deep wrinkles and aging bodies, but still with that characteristic look of those who had flown combat missions. They shared stories, remembered lost comrades, laughed and cried together. It was during that reunion that Torres had a profound conversation with Mendes, his former co-pilot on the day the submarine sank. Mendes confessed something he had kept hidden for 30 years. That day, when Torres made his last-second move, Mendes had thought it was a mistake. He had been about to question the decision, to suggest they follow standard procedure, but something held him back. Perhaps trust in Torres, perhaps fear of questioning at the critical moment. And then the bombs had landed perfectly, and Mendes had realized that Torres had seen something he hadn't, had calculated something he couldn't. That experience had shaped Mendes's entire subsequent career, teaching him to trust his team, to recognize that sometimes genius seems crazy until it works. Torres responded by admitting something he had also never said. He wasn't sure it would work. The last-second move was as much intuition as calculation, as much gamble as science. He could easily have failed. If he had, it would have been recorded as an error of judgment, a waste of ammunition, a lesson in why always follow procedure. Success had transformed a risky gamble into tactical brilliance, but the line between the two had been very, very thin. That honesty, that admission of doubt and uncertainty, earned Torres even more respect among his peers. They understood he was not an infallible superhero, but a man who had made a difficult decision under extreme pressure and had the luck and skill to make it work. The years passed. Torres formally retired from aviation in the 1980s, though he still gave occasional lectures and attended veterans events. He watched his children grow up, graduate and build families of their own. He watched his grandchildren be born and grow up in a world that, while far from perfect, was not torn apart by World War. He saw technologies he could barely have imagined during his coastal patrol days. Commercial jets crossing oceans in hours, satellites tracking submarines from space, computers processing in seconds calculations that took minutes in the cockpit of a Hudson. In 1993, 50 years after the sinking of U-513, there was a special ceremony in Rio de Janeiro honoring veterans of the Battle of the Atlantic. Torres was there, now 76, moving more slowly but still with that penetrating gaze, There were speeches from military officers, politicians, and historians. But the most powerful moment came when Torres was invited to speak. He walked slowly to the microphone, looked out over the audience of hundreds, and began not with the story of the submarine sinking, but with a reflection on memory. He spoke about how we remember war, how we tend to focus on the dramatic moments, the clear victories, the individual heroes. But he insisted that the true story of war lies in the thousands of small moments, the hundreds of patrols without incident, the silent sacrifices of families back home, the constant fear and tension that were the norm. The submarine sinking was a moment. Important, yes, but only one moment in a war that involved millions of people and countless acts of courage and sacrifice. He then spoke about the 48 crew members of WWII 531. He took the list of names from his pocket, the list he had carried for decades, and read some of the names. Carl Schmidt, 18, from Berlin. Hans Meller, 25, from Munich. Friedrich Weber, 32, from Hamburg. He said these men were enemies in the context of war, but they were human in every context. Their deaths had been necessary to protect Brazilian lives, but that didn't make them any less dead, didn't make their families any less grieving. The audience was completely silent. Some wept openly. This wasn't the typical narrative of military glory they'd expected. It was something deeper, more honest, more painful. Torres concluded by saying he hoped this generation would be the last to have to make the choices he had, that future generations could resolve their conflicts through dialogue and diplomacy, rather than bombs and torpedoes. After the ceremony, many people came to talk to Torres. Some were veterans sharing their own stories. Some were family members of people who had served or died in the war. But one conversation in particular stuck with Torres. It was a young woman, perhaps 20, a history student. She asked him if he believed the war had changed something fundamental in human nature, whether it had made people better or worse. Torres thought for a long time before answering. He said that war had not changed human nature, but had revealed its full scope. It had shown what humans are capable of at their best and worst. A capacity for incredible sacrifice and unimaginable cruelty, extraordinary courage and paralyzing fear, profound love and violent hatred. War was a mirror that reflected everything we were, without filters or disguises. And if there was one lesson to be learned, it was that we should work to create societies and systems that encourage the best of our natures and control the worst. Because the potential for both was always present within each of us. Torres lived his final years in peace. He died peacefully in 1997, surrounded by his family. His last words, according to his daughter, were about flying. He said he felt like he was back on the Hudson, flying over the ocean, but this time there were no submarines, no bombs, no war. Just the endless sky and the eternal sea, and a sense of absolute freedom. Then he closed his eyes and departed. The funeral was well attended. Military officers, veterans, family, friends, and students he had inspired with his lectures. There were military honors, rifle salutes, and a carefully folded flag presented to his widow. But the tribute that would have meant the most to Torres came from an unexpected source. The German embassy sent a representative who laid a wreath on the grave with a simple message: "In memory of an honorable warrior who never forgot the humanity of his enemies." Torres's story has been preserved in various ways. Naval history books mention the sinking of U-513. Military museums display photos of him and his aircraft. Brazilian Air Force schools study his tactics. But perhaps the most fitting memorial is a small plaque installed on a beach in Recife, overlooking the Atlantic. The plaque mentions no sunken submarines or last-second moves. It simply reads Colonel Alberto Martins Torres, 1917 to 1997. He flew over these waters to protect his people. He never forgot that even in war we are all human. And so the story continues to be told. Each generation rediscovers it, reinterprets it through the lens of its own time. For some, it's a story of heroism and tactical skill. For others, it's a story about the moral costs of war. For others still, it's a reminder that history is made by real people with real doubts, real fears, and real humanity. All of these interpretations are valid, because history is rich and complex enough to contain them all. What remains constant is the central lesson, that critical moments require not just skill, but the courage to make difficult choices. That success often depends on doing something different at the right moment. that even in victory, we must remember the humanity of those who were defeated, and that we must always work to create a world where such critical moments are never necessary again. We thank the Lord God for allowing stories like this to be preserved and shared, so that we can learn from the past and build a better future. We thank Him for the wisdom He grants to those facing impossible times, for the strength He offers when all seems lost, for the compassion He plants in hearts even in the midst of conflict. May we always recognize that each life is a divine gift, each person is a sacred creation, and that our responsibility to the Lord God is to value and protect this life, working for peace, understanding, and reconciliation among all peoples on earth. May this story inspire not violence but wisdom, not war but peace, not hatred but love for our neighbor. And may we always remember that we are all children of the same Creator, called to live not in conflict but in harmony, reflecting the goodness and mercy of the Lord God in all we do. Amen.